The atmosphere inside the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard during the biting, bone-chilling winter of 1943 was anything but comfortable. The air hung thick and heavy, saturated with the sharp, pungent scent of heated machine oil, the metallic sting of welding ozone, and the relentless, low-frequency vibration of wartime urgency humming through every beam and rivet of the enormous facility. The Second World War was burning ferociously across two vast oceans simultaneously, and the overwhelming industrial strength and manufacturing power of the United States had been forcefully and completely pulled into the very heart of the global conflict. Every factory, every shipyard, every engineering desk in the country was pointed in a single desperate direction toward winning a war that showed no signs of slowing down. Tucked deep inside a dimly illuminated engineering office, positioned far away from the sprawling ice-covered dry docks where massive steel warships were being assembled in the freezing open air, a thoughtful and dedicated man named Richard James was quietly waging his own private, but enormously significant battle against the fundamental laws of physics. Richard was a mechanical engineer by both training and temperament, the kind of man whose entire mental landscape was constructed from tensile strength calculations, load-bearing capacity charts, and structural integrity assessments. His mind was a machine, precise and methodical, built to solve problems that had real, measurable, physical consequences. And the United States Navy had just handed him one of the most consequential problems of the entire war effort. Deep within the thick-walled steel hulls of the enormous battleships being produced at a furious pace for deployment to the Pacific Fleet, a dangerous and persistent mechanical failure was quietly threatening lives. Delicate navigational instruments and precisely calibrated horsepower monitoring gauges were being systematically destroyed by vibration. Every time a warship was battered by powerful and turbulent ocean swells or rattled by the concussive, earth-shaking force of its own heavy artillery firing at full power, the intense shock waves traveling through the hull would shatter the glass faces of the instruments and snap the fine indicator needles clean off the gauges that sailors depended upon to navigate safely and to keep their vessels operating correctly. A single broken navigational gauge during a nighttime engagement at sea could mean the difference between a ship finding its course and a ship sailing blindly toward a hidden reef. A failed horsepower meter could make it impossible for an engineer to calculate the precise engine output needed to outmaneuver an incoming torpedo. The invisible but very real weight of thousands of unseen sailors trusting in the accuracy of those instruments rested heavily and squarely on the shoulders of the engineers hunched over drafting tables in the cold. Richard's specific assignment was to design and perfect a suspension spring. He needed to engineer a precisely wound coil of metal that was simultaneously strong enough to firmly hold heavy and critical equipment in place, yet sensitive and flexible enough to instantaneously absorb and neutralize the violent shock waves that a warship endured in combat conditions. He was working primarily with high-carbon Swedish steel, a material widely respected in engineering circles for its extraordinary mechanical memory and remarkable resilience under repeated stress. It was a stubborn and demanding material to work with, resistant to manipulation, requiring the application of intense heat and enormous mechanical force to bend and shape it into precise configurations required. Richard spent exhaustingly long and largely solitary shifts hunched forward over his drafting desk, surrounded on all sides by complex engineering schematics, precision slide rules, and towering stacks of heavy steel coils in various stages of testing. He was obsessively and systematically evaluating the tension characteristics of different metallic alloys, twisting them, compressing them, and stretching them to their limits, working until the muscles in his hands locked into rigid cramps and his vision grew unfocused from sheer physical and mental exhaustion. The cumulative physical toll of this level of relentless, all-consuming focus was immense and undeniable. Day after demanding day, his spine curved under the combined weight of the difficult technical work and the silent but ever-present pressure of knowing that the outcomes of his calculations had life-and-death implications somewhere out on the open ocean. It was during one of these marathon sessions of isolated, concentrated work that the defining moment of Richard James's life arrived completely unannounced, carried not by intention or careful planning, but by a purely random and wonderfully ordinary accident. He was reaching across his cluttered and overloaded workspace, his conscious mind entirely submerged in the complex mathematical world of shock absorption coefficients and spring rate formulas. His elbow made careless contact with a specialized high-tension torsion spring, that had been resting precariously close to the edge of a high storage shelf. The heavy coil of blue-black metal tipped silently over the edge and began its descent. Richard instinctively flinched, bracing himself for the sharp, chaotic, metallic clatter of dense steel colliding violently with the hardwood floorboard below. But the crash he anticipated never arrived. The spring did not fall in a disordered, tangled heap of wire. It did not simply drop straight down the way an inanimate object is supposed to. Instead, quite remarkably, it stepped. The dense steel coil flipped gracefully end over end, descending in a smooth and rhythmic cascade down a nearby stack of heavy technical reference manuals, each loop transferring its momentum fluidly to the next in a mesmerizing, almost choreographed sequence. It landed softly on the wooden surface of the drafting desk below, gathered its own accumulated kinetic momentum with what seemed like quiet confidence, and vaulted itself elegantly down onto the floor. It did not bounce erratically or roll away into a forgotten corner beneath a cabinet. It simply and neatly gathered itself back together, snapping upright into a perfect, quietly vibrating cylinder, standing completely upright near the toes of Richard's heavy leatherwork boots. Richard froze entirely. He stood completely motionless, staring down at the gently humming metal coil sitting on the floor at his feet. For a long, suspended moment, the entire world seemed to grow very still around him. The constant mechanical noise of the shipyard outside the thin walls of his office seemed to fade and dissolve into complete silence. The spring appeared almost alive, as though it possessed some hidden awareness of its own movement. In that single fluid, spontaneous, and entirely unplanned motion, the engineer suddenly understood something profound. He had not simply dropped a piece of naval hardware. He had inadvertently captured the behavior of gravity itself. He had stumbled into the accidental invention of a mechanical loop, a physical system that stored and released kinetic energy with a smooth, almost impossibly graceful continuity. He did not yet fully grasp the magnitude of what he was looking at. He did not yet know that in this cold, dimly lit shipyard office, surrounded by the sounds of a world at war, he had just brought into existence something that would become one of the most universally recognized and enduringly beloved objects in American cultural history. The single continuous length of precisely engineered and carefully bent Swedish steel will within just a few short years become a familiar and cherished presence in nearly every family living room across the country. It was an object of completely pure and unadorned joy, requiring no electrical batteries, no power cables, and no complicated instruction manuals to operate or understand. It was a toy that would eventually generate a staggering and almost difficult-to-comprehend financial legacy. But to understand the full and remarkable story of this invention, it is necessary to look beyond the happy accident and follow the long, winding, and deeply human journey of the people who carried it forward through triumph, difficulty, and ultimately extraordinary resilience. The transition from raw military hardware to an instrument of pure childhood wonder did not happen overnight. When Richard James had finally refined and perfected the tension of his spring to the level he was satisfied with, what he was holding in his hands was still, in every visible sense, a piece of industrial equipment. It was heavy, with a satisfying density of quality metal. It was coated in the residue of machine oil from the manufacturing process, and when it sat perfectly still on a workbench without moving, it looked thoroughly unremarkable to an untrained eye. It resembled nothing so much as a spare mechanical component intended for use in a large piece of industrial machinery, certainly not a plaything that would enchant an entire generation of children and their parents. In November of 1945, with the war finally over and the Christmas shopping season beginning to build momentum in Philadelphia, Richard and his remarkably capable and resourceful wife, Betty James, made a bold and considerable financial commitment to their belief in invention. They secured a $500 loan, representing an enormous and genuinely risky gamble of everything they possessed, to fund the first production run of the toy. Through persistence and persuasion, they managed to convince the manager of the well-known Jimbo's department store to allocate them a small section of retail display space at the end of a single busy counter in the toy department. The conditions were modest, the opportunity was limited, and for the first several hours of that debut, the results were genuinely discouraging. Shoppers walked directly past the display without pausing. The packaging was plain and understated. The object inside the box offered no bright, attention-grabbing colors, no cheerful painted faces, and no flashing lights to compete with the vibrant, energetic sensory environment of a busy department store during the holiday season. A motionless coil of metal, sitting quietly in a plain box, was practically invisible amid the noise and color of Christmas commerce. A quiet nervousness began to build. Richard recognized with sudden clarity that the entire magic of his invention did not exist in its static appearance. The magic lived exclusively in its movement. He stepped out from behind the display counter, lifted one of the coils of the dark Swedish steel with steady hands, and constructed a small inclined wooden ramp using a board and a stack of books. He reached back, gently pulled the top ring backward, held his breath for just a moment, and released it. The spring stepped smoothly and fluidly down the wooden incline. It was a movement that seemed to exist somewhere between physics and poetry, a graceful, looping, hypnotic cascade that gave a strong impression of something alive and purposeful walking calmly and deliberately down a set of steps. The rhythmic, musical sound of the tightly wound steel loops folding cleanly onto one another rang out sharply over the ambient noise of the crowded store. Nearby shoppers stopped mid-stride. A spontaneous crowd assembled quickly around the small demonstration. People leaning in, craning their necks, pushing gently forward to witness the remarkable walking metal more closely. The silent, unremarkable coil had revealed its secret soul in one fluid public moment. In exactly 90 minutes, all 400 units of the entire initial inventory had been sold. Shoppers were enthusiastically waving single-dollar bills in the air, genuinely excited to take home their own piece of the walking steel. The original product was an authentic masterpiece of mid-century engineering and material science. It was not the lightweight, easily tangled silver ribbon or the inexpensive molded plastic versions that might be found on retail shelves in later decades. The original was forged from precisely 80 feet of high-carbon, blue-black Swedish steel wire. The manufacturing process demanded the application of tremendous and precisely controlled mechanical pressure to wind that long, flat steel ribbon into a tight cylinder measuring 2.5 inches in diameter, concentrating within its compact form a remarkable amount of stored kinetic potential. There were no fasteners to tighten and no batteries to replace or recharge. The animating engine of the toy was the invisible and mathematically precise internal tension stored within the wound steel itself, waiting patiently to be released. It was a deeply sensory object in every respect. It was unmistakably heavy when held in the hand, possessing the confident weight of genuine quality metal. It was cool and smooth against the skin. When you transferred it slowly and deliberately from one open palm to the other, the sensation was less like holding a rigid manufactured object and more like cradling a slowly shifting, living liquid that responded continuously to the changing pull of gravity. And then there was the sound. The distinct, rhythmic, metallic percussion as it walked down a flight of wooden stairs was a perfectly timed acoustic event, a sound so specific and so recognizable that it would become permanently embedded in the collective sensory memory of the American household across multiple generations. While the engineering of the spring belonged entirely to Richard's technical genius and exhaustive experimentation, the identity and personality of the toy belonged completely and irrevocably to his wife. Betty James was the quietly essential architect of an enduring cultural empire. While Richard devoted his energy to the exact mathematical formulas governing spring rate and the tensile properties of different alloys, Betty was wrestling with an entirely different and equally complex challenge: how to present a piece of cold industrial metal to a mother shopping for a birthday gift for her 7-year-old child. She spent long, focused hours working her way carefully through the pages of a thick, unabridged dictionary, searching with patient determination for a single word, one perfect adjective, that could capture the mesmerizing, flowing, almost liquid quality of the steel coil's movement. She eventually discovered an older, less commonly used descriptive word meaning sleek, graceful, and sinuous in motion. She named her invention the Slinky. With that single, carefully chosen word, she accomplished something remarkable. She transformed a component of industrial military hardware into a warmly beloved character with a name that children could say and remember and ask for by name. The demand following the Gimbal's demonstration was immediate, enthusiastic, and entirely overwhelming in scale. The small workshop arrangement they had started with was wholly inadequate to meet the volume of orders that began arriving. They were required to expand their operations at a rapid and demanding pace. The James family constructed a large and fully equipped manufacturing plant to satisfy the enormous and growing appetite of the American public for their invention. Inside the factory, the machinery operated constantly and at full volume. Enormous industrial machines drew raw steel wire from massive spools, pulling it continuously through heavy rolling equipment that shaped and flattened the wire profile before feeding around high-speed spinning mandrels that wounded into coil after coil with breathtaking efficiency. The air inside the building was permanently thick with the smell of hot metal, lubricating oil, and the sharp electrical scent of powerful industrial motors running at full capacity. They were producing thousands of units every single day. The factory had essentially become a machine for converting coiled steel into economic abundance. They were selling a single dollar's worth of pure, uncomplicated joy to a nation that had just endured the most exhausting and emotionally draining global conflict in all of recorded human history. The American public was deeply and genuinely hungry for simplicity, for lightness, for something that asked nothing complicated of them. And nothing in the entire toy market was simpler or more satisfying than a carefully wound coil of steel wire that could walk gracefully down a staircase entirely under its own momentum. The financial success that followed was extraordinary by any measure. Richard and Betty moved their growing family into a large and beautiful country estate. They had 6 children together. From every outward appearance, the picture was one of complete and well-earned fulfillment. The returning wartime engineer, the brilliant and marketing-savvy wife, and a seemingly unstoppable commercial empire built entirely on a single happy accident of applied physics. But as the late 1950s began approaching, something was shifting quietly and significantly within Richard James. The factory machines never stopped running. The money continued to flow in at a remarkable rate. But the man who had set all of those machines into motion was beginning an interior journey that would carry him very far from everything he had built. Richard James was an engineer by nature, a man most comfortable and most confident in a world governed by solvable equations and predictable physical laws. But the sudden and overwhelming arrival of extraordinary personal wealth introduced a set of variables he found genuinely difficult to process or balance. He began to develop a deep and persistent sense of unease about the sheer scale of the fortune he had accumulated. He looked at the sprawling estate, the flourishing bank accounts, and the remarkable financial success of what had started as a simple coil of wire, and he felt a growing spiritual restlessness, a sense that something in his life had become fundamentally unbalanced. He was searching, with increasing urgency, for a way to restore a sense of inner equilibrium that money alone could not provide. In this searching and spiritually unsettled state of mind, he encountered an organization that offered what seemed to him like a compelling answer. It was a strict and highly structured fundamentalist Christian sect operating out of a remote and isolated settlement in the jungles of Bolivia. This group, led by a deeply passionate and persuasive individual, taught a rigorous doctrine centered on complete surrender of material possessions and the total withdrawal from modern commercial society. Their belief system held that genuine spiritual well-being could only be achieved by releasing all attachment to earthly wealth and retreating to a simple communal life, far removed from the influences of consumer culture. To a man wrestling with a profound sense of spiritual disconnection from his own financial success, this message carried a powerful and deeply personal appeal. Richard became increasingly devoted to this philosophy and to the community built around it, and his commitment began to reshape the decisions he was making in both his personal life and in the management of the company. What followed was a period of significant and consequential financial decisions that Richard made without the knowledge or participation of his wife and business partner. Holding the executive authority over the company's finances, he began directing substantial portions of the business's income toward supporting the Bolivian organization and its operations. He was redirecting the financial output of a thriving commercial enterprise toward a spiritual community that existed in philosophical opposition to the very type of commerce that had made the business possible. The company's tax obligations went unaddressed. The manufacturing plant became encumbered with debt that had not been disclosed to Betty. The financial foundation of the business was being systematically weakened from within, and the woman who had named the product, built its public identity, and been an equal partner in every aspect of its growth was entirely unaware of what was happening. The defining moment of rupture arrived in 1960. Richard James stood before Betty, the woman who had contributed her intelligence, creativity, and energy to building everything they had achieved together, and delivered a declaration that changed everything. He told her plainly that he intended to leave the United States permanently. He was going to relocate to the communal settlement in Bolivia and live according to the principles of the organization he had joined. He presented Betty with a choice. She could bring their 6 children and join him in this new life, or he would make the journey alone. Betty James, looking at the man across from her and then at her 6 children, whose entire futures were bound up in her response, made her decision without hesitation. She would not uproot her family and take her children into that kind of isolated and controlled environment. She declined firmly and completely. Richard walked out of the house. He boarded a plane. He left the country. He left behind his wife, his 6 children, and the company he had co-founded. And he traveled to South America to join the community that had captured his complete devotion. When Betty gained access to the company's financial records following his departure, what she found was deeply sobering. The bank accounts had been drained. The manufacturing plant was carrying a substantial burden of accumulated debt. Unpaid tax obligations to the federal government had been mounting for years. The company that had been producing thousands of units a day and generating enormous revenue was, in practical financial terms, in serious jeopardy. The road ahead for Betty James was not a path anyone could have navigated easily. She was a single mother of 6 children, standing in front of a factory full of employees counting on her, staring at financial obligations that would cause many people to simply walk away and start over somewhere smaller and simpler. Betty James chose a completely different response. She did not file for bankruptcy. She did not sell the patents to a larger competitor. She did not liquidate the machinery for whatever scrap value it might bring. She stepped forward, assumed complete executive control of the company, and began the hard and methodical work of rebuilding everything from a position of genuine financial vulnerability. She understood immediately that the existing manufacturing facility in Philadelphia was generating overhead costs that the company, in its weakened financial condition, simply could not continue to sustain. In 1964, she organized a complete relocation of the manufacturing operation to a more affordable facility in Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania. She did not approach this transition as a defeat or a retreat. She approached it as a strategic recalibration, the kind of disciplined decision-making that a well-run business requires in challenging circumstances. She walked the factory floor not as a grieving spouse or a reluctant caretaker, but as a determined chief executive who understood exactly what was at stake and was fully committed to protecting it. She knew with complete certainty that the product itself still possessed its original magic. The toy that had stopped a crowd of Philadelphia shoppers in their tracks in 1945 still had the same captivating movement, the same satisfying weight, the same remarkable acoustic quality on a hardwood staircase. The product had not changed. What needed to change was the financial structure around it and the public's renewed awareness of it. To reignite consumer demand and remind the American public of why they had fallen in love with the walking spring in the first place, Betty commissioned a television commercial and an accompanying piece of music that would prove to be one of the most effective and enduring advertising decisions in the history of the American toy industry. It was a simple, upbeat, and immediately memorable acoustic jingle that asked a cheerful question about what walks downstairs, alone or in pairs, and makes a wonderful Slinky sound. The commercial was an instant sensation. Consumer interest surged practically overnight. The factory in Pennsylvania roared back to full productive capacity. Through extraordinary personal determination and consistently intelligent business leadership, Betty James pulled the company back from the edge of financial failure and set it back on a path of sustainable growth. She paid off the accumulated debts methodically and completely. She settled the outstanding tax obligations in full. She secured the financial futures of her 6 children through the continued success of the company she had effectively rebuilt from the ground up. As the business stabilized and recovered, certain practical realities of manufacturing economics required difficult but necessary adjustments to the product itself. The original high-carbon blue-black Swedish steel that Richard had selected back in the shipyard office was a premium material that came with premium costs. The profit margins required to sustain the financial recovery that Betty was engineering could not comfortably absorb the expense of the original alloy indefinitely. The factory transitioned to a silver-colored galvanized steel. The new material still produced a fully functional and enjoyable toy, but those with a deep appreciation for the original version could detect a subtle difference in the quality of the experience. The galvanized spring was marginally lighter. It did not have quite the same dense, satisfying weight when held in the palm. The acoustic character of the sound on a wooden floor was slightly different. It was a necessary and pragmatic adjustment made in service of the larger goal of keeping the company healthy and its employees working. Later, as the toy market continued to evolve and consumer preferences shifted toward brightly colored, more affordable products, the manufacturing process eventually made the further transition to injection-molded plastic versions. The plastic Slinky brought the toy's visual identity into a new era of vibrant color and reduced production cost. But anyone who has held both an original steel version and a modern plastic one in their hands at the same time understands instinctively what the material change means for the experience. The plastic version does not carry the same kinetic authority. It lacks the mass necessary to sustain the flowing, self-perpetuating walking motion down a full flight of stairs with the same reliable elegance. The original sound, that perfectly timed metallic percussion that became the acoustic signature of countless childhood afternoons, is replaced by a lighter, less resonant quality. The shape remains. The name remains. But something essential about the original sensory experience belongs specifically to the steel, to the particular weight and memory of the material that Richard James chose in a Cold Wartime office, because it was the best material available for absorbing the shocks of a world at war. The complete story of the Slinky is ultimately a story about two very different kinds of human strength. It is a story about Richard James, a genuinely brilliant engineer who bent raw industrial steel to precise will and accidentally created an object of universal joy, but who ultimately found himself unable to navigate the unexpected pressures that extraordinary success placed on his inner life, and who chose a path of radical spiritual retreat that led him far from everything and everyone he had built his world around. And it is equally, and perhaps more compellingly, a story about Betty James, who proved through years of quiet, determined, and brilliantly executed work that she was built from a far more resilient material than anyone around her might have predicted. She absorbed the full force of a genuinely devastating set of circumstances, and rather than being flattened by them, she converted that energy into forward motion, exactly the way a well-engineered spring is designed to do. The next time you encounter that familiar silver coil sitting on a shelf, or hear that unmistakable rhythmic sound on a staircase, carry with you the full weight of the story behind it. It is a story about a winter office in a naval shipyard and an accident that stopped a man cold in the middle of a war. It is a story about a woman who spent days searching through a dictionary for a single perfect word. It is a story about a factory full of people who showed up every day and kept the machines running through some genuinely difficult years. And it is above all a story about the kind of strength that does not announce itself loudly, the kind that simply keeps working quietly and steadily, long after the noise of the crisis has faded, bending the material of an imperfect situation into something that can still walk beautifully forward on its own.